Now on to something I would say is a lot more exciting. In this chapter, it's not so much about individual elements, but it's going to be more about the overall shape language and furthering the stylization on this piece. So to start off with, I'm just looking at shapes that I feel like are a little bit tame and seeing what I can do to exaggerate them. So for the hat here, for example, there's already a little bit of a taper. There's some pointiness to the tips of the hat. So that's just what I'm focusing on, really just, pushing that further and exaggerating those shapes. For me in this chapter here, it's just really about playing around, seeing what I can do to further the design. What can I do to match the concept more closely? And where do I take liberties when it comes to translating the design into 3D? Like we've talked about previously, not everything translates one-to-one from a 2D concept to 3D. So sometimes you have to make some judgment calls and figure out what really works best in 3D space. Giving the same kind of treatment here to the gloves as the hat, and then trying to follow through with that design for all elements that really share this, let's call it common shape language. It's something that I've talked about quite a lot so far, shape language. And for those of you who might not be aware, shape language is just a way for us to define. It's like a common tongue for the design that we're working on. So for example, with Skull Kid here, his shape language is primarily a sharp, right? It's a sharp shape language. Something not, it's the opposite of round, soft, and squishy. Take Baymax from, I forgot the film. Is it even called Baymax? Anyway, the round guy, Baymax dude, his shape language is obviously, it's an exaggerated round shape. A lot of Disney characters, 3D Disney characters, have a very round shape language, right? They're very soft, they're very pleasant to look at, and that's kind of the effect that you achieve by incorporating a certain type of shape language into a character. So for someone who's possessed by Majora's Mask, we don't necessarily want that to be comfortable, for that to be nice, for that to be welcoming. On the other hand, we want it to be scary, we want it to be aggressive, intimidating, and that's something you can achieve with this kind of shape language. I think the stereotypes, there's or archetypical shapes when it comes to shape language. You have your rounds, your boxy and pointy kind of shape language, and you can mix and match those as you please, of course. It's oftentimes the soft round shapes are reserved for something comfortable, main characters, maybe something like that. The boxy designs are, let's see, if we look at it from a character perspective, be like a brute, someone more stern, grounded. They would have that kind of shape language. And then, the triangular or the pointy shape language is sort of used for bad guys, so to speak, right? It's always like the pointy face, pointy nose, pointy chin, pointy everything basically. And you can tweak this as much as you want. You can exaggerate it as much as you want, make it subtle. And like I said, you can mix all of them as well to get the feeling across that you want from a specific character. And it's very apparent here with Majora or Skull Kid that, it's primarily dominated by this triangular pointy shape language. There's not really a lot of round stuff. Everything is there's straight lines, and then there's pointy ends, right? So a lot of it just speaks to this unpleasant nature of the character. This is one of the issues you might run into when you start cutting off limbs and arms. Sometimes you need to tweak it a little bit, and that's what we're doing here. The arm got a little bit too detached once we started moving the shape around for the glove, but very, very easy to fix. So in between, changing the shape and changing certain aspects of elements on the character here, sometimes like here where the wrist starts to poke out, then I'll just go in and I'll start doing cleanup at the same time. Whenever I divide my work into these time blocks, I of course try to be focused on the task at hand, but inevitably, you have to be flexible. You can't just always only do that one thing that you're doing or set out to do, because other elements, when you're doing a character, everything is so dependent on everything else on the character, right? So when you change, for example, here the glove, that's going to impact the arm. Depending on how low or high up it terminates, that's going to affect the length of the sleeve, what's going to look good for the sleeve. So it's a constant, it's like a perfect harmony kind of thing where everything kind of has to work together. So while I think it helps being focused on one task at a time, especially when you're dividing it into these half-hour or 1 hour time blocks, it's important to also let yourself check other elements at the same time, I think it makes it easier to work with, just to make it more coherent. It's faster to do cleanup because you're kind of doing it along the way. A good example of differences in shape language is like if you look right here, the shirt or the dress right now, because it hasn't had any treatment that we've of the techniques that we've come up with through this tutorial so far. It's still very blobby, it's still very soft. So right now, if you were to leave it like this with this kind of shape, sure, you could subdivide it and clean it up a bit, it would feel out of place because it doesn't really match the rest of the shapes. Just trying to tweak, well, really erase and redo the kind of details that we created on the gloves just before it became too much. And then during cleanup and stuff, details get lost. So it's trying to figure out a good balance between that. It's that perfect balance between stylization with lack of detail and then enough detail to convey the kind of fabric or material that we have. Now let's move onto the dress here. Like I mentioned before, it just sticks out like a sore thumb because it's so soft compared to, especially if you look from the top down, right? The top of the hat to Majora's mask and even the gloves now. The dress and the pants right now really stick out. They do their job quite fine in terms of the silhouette, right? They define the boundaries of the character there, but they don't really respect the shape language that we're going for. So because this is a shape stylization chapter, it's not so much a cleanup chapter, it's just going over every single element, or as many elements as we have time for, and sort of force them into the same, it's called shape universe as everything else, or at least the direction that we want to take it in. It's interesting how you can change the perception of something like this. You know, you look at the dress right now. I don't really, yeah, I think it's a dress. You look at the dress right now. When you look at it in isolation, right, it looks very feminine. It's very soft. It's very pleasant to look at. It doesn't necessarily look like the type of, like a piece of clothing that would fit the current character that we're creating, right? And that's sort of the issue that you run into when you mix, let's say you mix like different ends of the spectrum of the shape language, then sometimes you can have inconsistencies that don't really work together. But it is fixable, even for something like this, when you have a dress on something that feels more like, you know, a male character, something that's more aggressive. You can still make the dress fit that shape language. It doesn't have to be soft. It doesn't have to be pleasant. You can make it unpleasant by applying the same rules of sharp lines and internal contrast within the shape. I just got rid of the inside of the dress because, as you saw, Dynamesh was not being cooperative. Once we start going over this with a polish brush, Damien standard here, it starts to protrude through the other side, and we can't work with it as fluidly as I would like. And in a situation like this, the Damien standard brush is a fantastic option because it really allows me to create that specific shape that I'm after. You can see everything else right now has just been done with the move brush just to create the bigger shapes. But they're still quite soft. And then we just go in and we create some peaks and some valleys with the Damien standard brush. And slowly, you know, we're morphing this into something that fits better with the character. And there's really no magic here either. I can't stress this enough, you know. But it's a very common, I guess, misconception for beginners especially, that in order to create something start to finish, whatever, you have a certain tool in your toolbox that they don't. I guess to some extent there's some truth to that. Like, the tool in your toolbox might just be experience, but there's nothing that you have access to in the software or on the internet that they don't, that gives you an edge in any way, really. You know, you all watch the same content, you have access to the same references. So it's good to keep in mind that nothing special goes on here. It's just years of experience building on top of what you've learned from previous projects. You can see the dress is starting to take on a very different feel now, you know. It's entering the realm of Majora, so to speak. You know, it feels like it's starting to fit more and more with the universe that this character would exist in. The ZRemesh here really just helps us a little bit with our cleanup, and then also how we start to treat the shapes, because when everything is dynameshed, right, it's the same problem as we had on the hat or the gloves, for example. Smoothing edges can be kind of tricky. The same thing happens internally. So ZRemeshing here and there can really help just clean up shapes along the way. I think it's like the third time now that we're repainting the glove. But we learn something new every time we do it. And like I said, you know, because it's so simple, the poly paint for the glove is, there's nothing advanced about it. There's nothing groundbreaking. It's just a couple colors thrown together with a snail on top. That's really all we're after. So repainting it just takes a couple minutes. It's not a big deal. And the thing is, even after you put paint on your model, but you then you then come to the realization that you need to change it, don't be afraid to erase what you have to improve on your shape, because ultimately the shape is more important than the paint. And obviously, yeah, it kind of sucks if you've done a lot of advanced poly painting on there. Then you kind of have to, you know, make up your mind if you feel like it's worth tweaking the shape more. Most of the time it is, I feel like. The shape is what dictates everything, really, you know. Painting is just the cherry on top. Just going back in there and cleaning up the little areas that got messed up from tweaking the shape. And then I also try to experiment just lightly with some more detail on the glove. You know, when I'm looking at the concept, I realized that the textured parts of Majora sort of have this straw texture on top, which gives them that straw look, right? So I'm trying to think about ways to integrate that, because we need to kind of integrate that on most things in the textures form. Just evaluating the shapes, taking a good long look at everything, seeing where everything's at, kind of noticing the sleeves here have been neglected for a long time. Don't really seem to defy gravity a little bit, and I'm not too happy about their shape either. So I'll proceed to try and do like shape integration with the stylized sleeves now. Now, spoilers, this is an area that I will struggle quite a lot with. Getting the transition correct from the torso to the sleeves, for some reason, is giving me a lot of issues here. It's, I don't know. It's easy to overcomplicate things, right? So you can tell that the lower part of the dress is very simple. It's just straight lines up and down, right? No problem. I'm trying to figure out ways to do that here on the sleeve as well. But there is a part where the upper part of the torso or the shoulder sort of connects to the sleeve, and trying to make that, integrate that to the dress, into the dress, I don't know. It's a little bit tricky. So we'll probably go over those areas a couple of times, seeing what we can do, figure out how to tweak the shapes. And here it helps that we've ZRemeshed it, especially when we're trying to make more extreme changes like this to the shape, because then the damien standard brush will just kind of follow along the edges, you know, straight edges that the ZRemesher has created. Whereas with Dynamesh, we don't really have control over the grid that sort of projects that grid pattern on top of the mesh. So sometimes it can end up looking a little bit messy. It's not a big deal, especially when we're dealing with very high-res objects, but it can make a difference. And besides, if I Dynameshed it again, it would cap the holes for the sleeves and the neck and the lower part of the dress. So I didn't want to have to bother with deleting things again, so I just ZRemeshed it. And see, the outer part of the sleeves here, they're fine. You know, they kind of do their thing, top to bottom, straight edges, but I'm still not sure on how to make that transition look good from the sleeve to the torso. So sometimes I just distract myself with some other things that need to be done. Then think about it, come back to it, do a little bit more, then maybe do another thing. So back and forth all the time. I found that if I'm struggling with an area, what I shouldn't do is just stay on it and keep sculpting forever. I'll just get frustrated, and the end result won't be as good. So I want to make a little lip here to sort of simulate that the sleeve has been sewn onto the torso, right? And then this is where I try to figure out that transitional area. I'm looking at the concept, seeing what they've done, and trying to figure out what I can do to best match that. So we have similar looking folds, or at least folds that make sense within the character here. Now, like interconnected styles or shapes, stylized shapes like these can be tricky sometimes, because when you're just doing straight up and down, right, the edge just terminates at the end of the mesh, or the edges of the mesh. It's just gone. You don't have to think about how it terminates. But when you have interconnected shapes that flow from one part to the next, then you have to consider the transition and how you want to end that shape. And that's the part that's giving me trouble here with the front of the sleeve, is trying to figure out the best approach to have these shapes all go together. Now, because I don't have the option of Dynameshing right now, because of well, I do have the option, I just don't want to create the caps on the holes right there. I've just subdivided the mesh just to give me the extra detail that I need. And then we'll go in afterwards, you know, with ZRemesher and clean all that stuff up. It's almost like you can feel my brain working here. It's it's trying to figure out, okay, what do we do here? The problem that I'm running into, I can tell you, is everything else shape-wise has a certain scale. Like, it's fairly large shapes. And the way I'm trying to solve this right now is by cramming smaller shapes into larger shapes. Now, there are a couple of issues with this for this particular character. It's not always an issue, but right here in terms of the design, is that it's creating a lot more detail that we have compared to what we have anywhere else on the character, right? So it becomes a focal point. We don't want our focal point to be the top of the shoulder. No one cares about that. We don't want people to look there. The objective of integrating shapes with each other like this is to create something that looks, for lack of a better word, like bland enough that it fits with the rest of the character, but not too good so that it draws the viewer's attention, right? So trying to do that right here is very tricky for me. And what I end up doing right now, you know, like you can see, is like we have these very fine wrinkles, small shapes that don't really fit in with anything else that we've done. So there are a lot of aspects to consider, especially when you're doing character work, because ultimately you'll want to have a focus, right? And the focus for this, for Skull Kid, Majora, is the mask, right? Majora's mask is like the centerpiece. But then when we look at the concept, another really important part to this is his right hand. You know, that it's not a fist, but the weird, almost possessed fingers. So trying to strike a balance between those two. And again, I could have cut this out and spared you all the pain and misery that I that I went through trying to fix this. But I think it's important sometimes to also show the more frustrating parts of character design, because it's not just a straight, you know, A to B journey. Sometimes we run into issues. A lot of times we run into issues, whether it be technical issues or design issues like this. It just does exist. So I hope this gives you a more accurate picture of what it's actually like. Another thing to consider here is, you know, how sharp do we make the shapes? It might seem like a arbitrary thing, but it's really important as well, because you don't want your shapes to be too hard, right? It still should represent that this is a piece of clothing and not like he's wearing a dress made out of metal. So we can't make it too sharp either. So striking that balance between soft and sharp is also part of the design problem here. I've just sort of abandoned the sleeve a little bit, you know, get my mind off of it, try to do other things. Sometimes I find that when I work on other areas that are not really problem areas like this, it gives me a different perspective on the problem area, and then I can sort of return to it with the new knowledge and try and incorporate that into the problem area and see if that will work for me. So we're getting somewhere now. That looks a little bit better. Still working with the smaller shapes here, which sadly will have to go. Yeah, and you can see the way that the shapes, they connect. It doesn't really make sense. That's the, you know, another part of the problem when you're working on a translation from 2D to 3D, is that things can make a lot of sense in 2D, especially internal shapes, cloth shapes like this. But once you actually start treating it in 3D, it can look very strange. So I think what we'll do is just nuke all of this, because it's definitely not working. And then, you know, different strategy, but just get rid of it. Sometimes it's the best approach. just to get rid of what you have because it's not working. You might kind of get stuck in that track of, okay, I have this initial line here and I have to follow that line because, you know, I've committed to it. But that's really not the case with 3D. You know, you can always go in, erase all of your work, and now start from scratch because you still have something. Here I'm looking at this line here for that fold and realizing that, okay, that happened to be placed in a fortunate spot that I kind of liked. It gave me a big fold and sort of a more, it looks more cohesive already just by erasing that top part, right? So I'm like, okay, here's something that I can work with that I feel like, okay, now I'm on the right track. None of that weird interconnected stuff, but just something a lot more simple and with bigger shapes, fewer of them as well. They can be smaller. There's no, you know, there's no hard and fast rule saying that you can't mix different shapes like that, or in terms of the size, because obviously some parts will just need smaller shapes. It just has to make sense for the scale. And what we did before, right here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 sort of pointy areas, pointy bits in our view. Whereas before we had like 7, maybe 8, you know? So we've already cut down a lot on that detail level, and it's starting to feel a lot more appropriate. One thing that we will have to address a little bit later, you know, once we're kind of satisfied with all of this, is going to be the edges of the dress, the way it terminates. You see some places it kind of wraps in on itself, and it's not all too clean, but we will deal with that in a little bit. Again, luckily for us, this back part isn't as important. You know, like I said in one of the earlier chapters, I think we'll focus on this piece to work from like 270, 300 degrees, not 360. So from the side, maybe to the other side, and then a little beyond. So the way the back folds from the sleeve, or the folds from the back of the sleeves integrate with the back, it's not really that much of a priority. And sometimes it can be helpful as well to just isolate certain parts. One, it's easier to work with, you know, the mesh doesn't obscure itself, but also just from a pure work perspective, it can be easier if you just look at that one part in isolation sometimes. Then once you have something that you feel like you're happy with, bring the rest back, try to compare it and see like, okay, I feel like I'm getting somewhere that fits together now. And then go back and forth and do that. This inner part of the sleeve, it's not crucial that it works 100%. It doesn't have to be crazy stylized. You know, if we render it and light it, it will be mostly in shadow. But because we do see part of the inside of the sleeve there, you know, from the other sleeve or from the other side when you look at it through the camera, I do still want there to be just some indication of detail in there, just so it doesn't look completely bland. That's the issue that you run into when you're doing a stylized piece like this that has very sharp shapes. If there are any shapes that don't follow that shape language, they will create contrast, they will stick out. Now that's fine if that's the intent. You know, if you want it to stick out, if you want that to be the focal point, then go ahead. But for me, that's not what I'm after. And so here, to bring it all together a little bit more, I'm gonna use clay polish just to tighten everything a little bit. And you can experiment with that, see if there's any settings for you that work better than others. But with clay polish, it just removes a little bit of that sculptural detail and just focuses on the sharper edges. It's a great tool for hard surface as well. You can't erase everything. You can see we still have some wobbliness here, and that's just some leftover stuff from when it was dynameshed. Then we subdivided it. We didn't really clean it up, but we can go in, smooth that out now that we have our initial lines with Damien standard, and then just, you know, treat the same as we have from the beginning. Another aspect to consider is that not everything will be visible. So here the bib covers some of it, the belt covers some of it. So I'm not going to focus on all of those bits that are really invisible to the camera anyway. Now, if he was going to be animated and had to move around and the bib would fly up and the belt would move around, then obviously you would have to deal with that. The nice thing about having multiple elements within one element is that you can see here, you know, we terminate these wrinkles from the armpit down to the belt, and then we just terminate them there. We don't do anything else with them. We don't have to follow through with them. They don't have to integrate to the lower part where the skirt is. We can focus our attention just on that part and not so much the integration part. And from a logical perspective, you could also think about it this way, that the belt creates compression within the fabric, and the compression is what's causing there to be more wrinkles there. Still struggling a little bit with that transition. Not too much. It's in a good spot now, I think. It's looking decent. Might want to clean up that little extra fold there. I'm not sure yet. Just surveying a little bit, getting a picture of everything. And now I'm duplicating the mesh because we want to fix up the edges here. So I'll start playing around with different techniques to see what's the best approach for cleaning up the ends. One example is that you can change the smoothing interpolation of your smooth brush to allow it to smooth border edges. By default, you know, the smooth brush doesn't allow you to smooth that, but that's a setting you can enable. And I'm just looking. So that's the annoying thing about Dynamesh, right? It caps it by default. Maybe you want that, maybe you don't. So we're just going to try out a few different things here to make a clean edge that we can then cut off entirely, and then maybe leave the dress single-sided actually. Going back here, undoing the Dynamesh thing. You can see just smoothing out the edges here gives us an even softer result. Not necessarily what we want. I think what we're gonna do instead is create some polygroups in that area by cutting it off, maybe tweaking the shape a little bit, then slicing it just to get a more clean edge. I think that'll work better. So I'm just trying to cut off all the pieces that wrap in on themselves. You can see there's a tiny piece left here. I just want all the pieces that are straight, essentially, that go straight up and down mostly, and don't wrap in underneath the dress, because that's kind of the issue currently, is that it has this soft look that slopes down and then under itself. So we'll create a separate polygroup for this, and then I'll show you some magic with the polygroups smooth groups brush. That's what it's called. It doesn't matter that we're losing like a little bit of the dress here. You know, we can always, once it's clean, we can always take it and move it down again, because we have the overall shape, and because it's just a repeating shape from top to bottom, it's not a big deal. The nice thing here is that we can cut in with the select lasso tool right there in the inner part where the valley is, and get rid of that smooth transition between the two shapes. Make it a little more, I guess, hard. Like that. Give it more of a star shape. There we go. Now we have separate polygroups for that. And then we can more easily work with that. Now here, by mistake, I chose to delete hidden to see if we could just smooth out the areas by ZRemeshing it here, but we actually end up with a, I don't know, an even worse result because of the jagged edges. The way that it ZRemeshes, that it tries to figure out what should I do in this area. So instead of that, go back to before we deleted the hidden part. So now we have different polygroups. Then we go into smooth brushes and find the smooth groups brush. Now the smooth groups brush is great because its sole focus is just to smooth out border edges between polygroups. Just average that border edge out until you have something that's pretty straight. So you can do that all across the dress. So let's get our polygroups back here. And then we have pretty wobbly edges there. Invert that, get that to be one polygroup. Now we only have two polygroups, so it might be a little tricky to see here with polyframe enabled. But yeah, okay, you can see that once we start smoothing this, we get a lot, like the edge just becomes a lot tighter. And this doesn't affect the surface that much. Like if you had sculptural detail, like pores and stuff on here, it might mess that up. But for our purposes, because we're still working with a fairly simple shape, it works really well. You can smooth that out and just get a really crisp edge. And ZRemesher is going to look at that and understand a lot better what we want out of it now. Yeah, you can see there it does deform the mesh just a tiny bit, but it's nothing that we can't clean up. So now we have a much more smoother edge, something that's a lot cleaner. So we do the whole thing again, we delete hidden, we find our ZRemesher, and we try to remesh that. Like I said, sometimes legacy works better for me, sometimes it doesn't. So I try to go back and forth between the two to see what gives me the best result. And right here, what I'm really looking for is the way that the edges fall, and ZRemesher has sort of conformed the edges quite nicely to the way I've laid down the lines on the dress. So I'm quite happy with that. And then because I duplicated the dress just before, I still have the details from the higher res version, which we can then just go on and project onto the mesh again. Just going back and forth a little bit, just to see what impact subdividing it and projecting it actually had. And there we go. So it's a mixed chapter, you know, with the stylization and tweaking the shapes. But now we're definitely a lot closer to where we want to be. And I'll see you in the next chapter.